At 7:42 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Gender stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft return from Pearl Harbor. The task force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, maintaining strict radio silence during the 12-day voyage across the North Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers in formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers. It was the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. The carriers gently pitched in the Pacific swell. The morning air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal from recovered aircraft engines, and salt spray. Pilots and deck crews were celebrating, embracing each other, shouting and laughing with relief and euphoria. The tension that had gripped the task force for 12 days had broken. They had done it. They had struck the Americans and survived. The attack had been devastating. 4 American battleships were sunk outright. The Arizona exploded with such force that debris rained down across Ford Island, a quarter-mile away. The Oklahoma capsized completely, rolling 150 degrees to port and trapping more than 400 men inside her hull. The West Virginia and California sank to the bottom of the harbor, their superstructures still visible above water, but their hulls shattered by torpedo hits. 4 more battleships were damaged so badly that they appeared to be total losses. The Nevada had tried to get underway during the attack, but had been beached to prevent sinking in the harbor channel. The Pennsylvania was in dry dock, damaged but repairable. The Maryland and Tennessee were trapped behind capsized ships, their decks torn by bomb hits. In total, 18 ships were either destroyed or crippled. 2,403 Americans were dead, and hundreds more were wounded. Japan had lost only 29 aircraft out of 353 launched, a mere 8% loss. By any measure, it was an overwhelming victory. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the airstrike, landed on Akagi's deck and reported to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo that the mission had been a complete success. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled, clearing the way for Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia. The pilots were jubilant, exhausted, talking over each other about their experiences, but Gender stood apart, watching silently. He was 37 years old, one of the most brilliant aviation tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had spent months designing the operation, from training schedules to target priorities, but the numbers running through his mind told a different story than the celebration suggested. A story about oil barrels and industrial capacity. A story about logistical miscalculations that had been catastrophic from the start. A story that meant Japan had won a devastating tactical victory while guaranteeing its eventual strategic defeat. The problems. Everyone was focused on the massive steel fortresses burning and sinking in the harbor, but Gender knew that battleships were becoming obsolete. The future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines, not to slow-moving gun platforms that could be destroyed by aircraft they could never reach. The real problem, the fatal problem, was what the Japanese aircraft had not attacked. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. There were 49 massive cylindrical tanks spread across 3 separate facilities built over decades to support the Navy's operations in Hawaii. The Lower Tank Farm, built between 1913 and 1923, held around 1.4 million barrels in 22 tanks of varying sizes. The Middle Tank Farm held about 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks, and the Upper Tank Farm, the largest, held about 2.5 million barrels in 17 tanks. Together, they constituted the entire fuel supply for the United States Pacific Fleet. Admirals state that Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of fuel, and all of it was vulnerable to a .50 caliber bullet, let alone bombs. The tanks were made of thin steel plate designed only to hold liquid under atmospheric pressure, not to withstand military attacks. They were clearly visible, from the air, and Japanese reconnaissance had identified them. Tadashi Morimura, operating under the alias Tako Yoshiawa from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, had spent months observing Pearl Harbor, noting the locations of ships, aircraft, and key infrastructure. He had reported the fuel storage's location to Tokyo. The tanks were extraordinarily vulnerable. A bomb, even a smaller 500-pound bomb, could rupture a tank completely, spilling the oil and igniting it. Fuel oil doesn't explode spectacularly like gasoline. but it burns intensely and persistently. A ruptured tank would create a massive fire, which would spread from tank to tank, destroying the entire complex. If the tanks had been destroyed, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The Pacific Fleet had only 760,000 barrels of fuel in its oilers and ship bunkers combined, less than 16% of what was stored at Pearl Harbor. In the first 9 days after the attack, the fleet had used up almost its entire seaborne fuel capacity. Without the shore-based storage at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet would have been completely immobilized. Without that fuel supply, the fleet would have had to abandon Pearl Harbor and retreat to the west coast, 2,000 miles away. American ships would have needed twice as much fuel just to get to the western Pacific war zones. The U.S. Navy's operational range would have been halved, crippling its ability to interfere with Japan's conquests in Southeast Asia for at least 12 to 18 months. But the Japanese aircraft never attacked the fuel tanks. Not one bomb was dropped on them. The attack plan had not included the fuel storage facilities as a priority target. This mistake, this oversight, would prove to be one of the most costly errors of the war. Pilots had not been briefed about the importance of the oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor. No special ordnance had been allocated for their destruction. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes focused exclusively on the battleships, large, dramatic targets that appeared strategically vital but were quickly becoming obsolete. Meanwhile, the truly important targets, aircraft carriers, submarines, repair facilities, dry docks, and most critically, the fuel storage tanks, were either absent from the attack plan or deliberately ignored in favor of sinking battleships. This was no accident. It was the direct result of fundamental miscalculations made months earlier during the planning phase. These miscalculations involved issues like fuel consumption, oil production, tanker capacity, and how long Japan could sustain a war without access to American oil imports. Captain Kamito Kurushima, who served as senior staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto, was one of the most intellectually brilliant officers in the Japanese Navy. He had an unusual reputation, often working naked in his cabin, claiming that clothes distracted him from strategic thinking. He consumed vast quantities of rice and could recite the fuel capacity and cruising range of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets from memory. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical question. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer was tied entirely to oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum, with approximately 32 to 37 million barrels used each year for both military and civilian purposes. Most of that oil came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. When the U.S. imposed an oil embargo on Japan on July 26, 1941, following Japan's occupation of southern French Indochina, Japan was suddenly cut off from more than 80% of its oil import. Britain and the Dutch government followed with their own embargoes. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves, which were divided between the Navy, the Army, and civilian use. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone consumed about 2,900 barrels of fuel per hour during peacetime operations, translating to around 69,600 barrels per day, or 25.4 million barrels per year. With its oil reserves running low, Japan faced two choices: either capitulate to American demands and withdraw from China, or go to war to seize the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out. Japan chose war. This decision rested on three critical assumptions. Each seemed reasonable at the time, but each would ultimately be disastrously wrong. The first assumption was that the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed that after 6 to 8 months of fighting, the United States would negotiate a settlement, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, the U.S. would agree to a compromise, allowing Japan to control Southeast Asia. This assumption meant that fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign, not long-term sustainability. The second assumption was that Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine that had been the strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima. The Japanese fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to approach. The Japanese Navy would then engage in 1 or 2 major fleet battles, destroying the American fleet in climactic surface actions. This meant that only a small portion of the fleet would be actively operating at any time, and fuel consumption would be minimal. The third assumption was that capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would permanently solve Japan's fuel problem. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Japanese planners estimated that military consumption would require 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing these fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded that Japan could fight and win. The math appeared sound, and the strategy seemed viable, but all three assumptions proved to be catastrophically wrong. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate a settlement after 6 months. Instead, the American public united after Pearl Harbor, and American industrial capacity shifted into full war production. The U.S. began building warships and producing tanks and aircraft, and the conflict would last far longer than the Japanese had expected. Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle doctrine. The war became something entirely different, involving continuous operations across vast distances. Carrier task forces conducted raids on enemy bases thousands of miles away. Submarines hunted convoys. Amphibious assaults required large escort forces. Every operation required constant movement and fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel per day. When operating at high speeds, fuel consumption increased to 300 or 400 tons per day. The planning assumptions had underestimated fuel consumption by a large margin. By mid-1942, Japan was operating dozens of destroyers on various missions, each burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption. As the war intensified, fuel consumption continued to exceed planning estimates. In fiscal 1942, Japan consumed 41.79 million barrels of fuel, and by 1943, consumption reached 43.9%, 9 million barrels. This was much higher than the initial estimates. The second disastrous mistake was that capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces captured the oil fields in 1942, they found the infrastructure had been extensively sabotaged. Dutch engineers had destroyed key facilities before the Japanese arrived, blowing up pumping stations, setting wells on fire, and removing critical components. Even facilities that appeared intact often had subtle damage that rendered them unusable. The Japanese lacked the necessary petroleum engineering expertise to restore production to pre-war levels. Moreover, Japan faced a severe shortage of ships to transport the oil from the East Indies back to Japan. Merchant ships were already in high demand, and American submarines were targeting them. Every ship sunk carrying oil or equipment slowed down the restoration of oil production. By 1942, production from the Dutch East Indies had fallen to just 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of pre-war levels. Although production improved in 1943 to 49.6 million barrels, it still did not meet Japan's needs. Meanwhile, the submarine campaign targeting oil tankers was preventing the oil from reaching Japan. The final catastrophic error was assuming Japan would be able to quickly restore oil production. By 1943, the Japanese had managed to restore production to 76% of pre-war levels, but by then, the tanker shortage was critical. The need for replacement equipment and ships to transport oil created a perfect trap. The more Japan tried to restore oil production, the more ships were sunk by submarines, further depleting resources. These three critical errors, miscalculations about the length of the war, fuel consumption, and the ability to restore oil production, would doom Japan before the first shot was fired. The Japanese strategists failed to accurately calculate the shipping capacity required to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan. And, more critically, they underestimated the vulnerability of that shipping to American submarines. The logistical geography was a significant challenge. The distance from Borneo to Japan is around 2,000 nautical miles, and from Sumatra, it's even farther. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had a cargo capacity of around 10,000 tons dead weight, or roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At a cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, which was economical for tanker operations, a round trip from Borneo to Japan took about 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time. This meant a single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering around 975,000 barrels annually if there were no losses or delays. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in the captured territories in 1943, Japan needed around 50 tankers operating continuously. However, in December 1941, Japan had only about 49 ocean-going tankers, barely sufficient for peacetime needs. The Japanese tanker fleet was already too small to meet wartime demands. Constructing new tankers was not a quick solution, as they took 8 to 10 months to build, and Japan's shipyards were already fully occupied with warship construction. Tankers were considered unglamorous and often overlooked in favor of warships like destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. While Japan was building a powerful military fleet, American submarines were systematically targeting Japan's tanker fleet in one of the most successful submarine campaigns in naval history. U.S. submarines focused on tankers, recognizing them as critical to Japan's logistics. Tankers had to pass through choke points like the Luzon Strait, where American submarines lay in ambush. Each tanker sunk meant less oil reaching Japan, but the consequences went beyond simple tonnage losses. As tankers were sunk, the remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. This led to longer voyages, which exposed the tankers to even more risks from submarines. Tanker crews became demoralized as losses mounted, and the psychological toll made operations even more difficult. By late 1942, the tanker shortage became critical. Japanese oil imports were falling, not because production in the captured territories was dropping, but because there were not enough ships to transport the oil. The submarine campaign created a transportation choke point that severely restricted Japan's oil supply. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels to approximately 38 million barrels. The burn rate exceeded the peaceful projections, and consumption was rising. As Japan's reserves dwindled, the Imperial Navy faced a grim reality. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions about oil production in the occupied territories, Japan's oil reserves would be exhausted by mid-1943. The Japanese Navy began discussing emergency measures, but every solution had significant problems. One suggestion was to increase tanker construction, but the shipyards were already at maximum capacity, prioritizing warships. Another proposal was to reduce the operational tempo across all forces to conserve fuel, but this would mean allowing the Americans to advance on. Japan also considered moving its fleet closer to the oil fields in Southeast Asia to save on transportation. However, this would mean the fleet would be stationed far from where the decisive battles were taking place, which compromised their effectiveness. A fourth proposal was to use lower-grade fuels, such as unrefined crude oil, but this caused maintenance problems and damaged the ships. Finally, Japan looked into developing synthetic fuel production, but this would take years to set up, and the technology was not developed enough. By the middle of 1943, Japan's oil situation was dire. Consumption was at 3.7 million barrels per month, and production was far below what was needed. The tanker shortage, compounded by the successful American submarine campaign, left Japan unable to transport enough oil to sustain military operations. As the war continued, the Japanese fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel shortages. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers could not maneuver freely because they were operating at the extreme limits of their fuel range. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato made a final desperate attempt to reach Okinawa, using only enough fuel to reach its destination. Even this was not enough, and the ship was sunk by American aircraft. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, its oil reserves were depleted, and the fleet was immobilized. The oil fields in Southeast Asia were still producing, but there were no tankers left to transport it. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit that was predictable and calculable from the start. Admiral Yamamoto had warned that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The math was clear. Without access to enough oil, Japan's military would be doomed. Yamamoto's predictions proved accurate, as the inability to maintain a consistent supply of oil directly contributed to Japan's defeat. Strategists had failed to properly calculate the amount of shipping capacity needed to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, and more critically, they didn't account for how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine attacks. The geography of the situation made the problem worse. The distance from Borneo to Japan was around 2,000 nautical miles, and from Sumatra it was even farther. A typical Japanese tanker could carry about 75,000 barrels of oil, and at an economical cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, a round trip from Borneo to Japan would take about 4 weeks, including loading and unloading. This meant a single tanker could theoretically make 13 trips per year, delivering 975,000 barrels annually. To transport 49 million barrels of oil, Japan would need around 50 tankers operating constantly. However, in December 1941, Japan had only 49 ocean-going tankers, barely enough for peacetime. Japan's shipyards were already at full capacity building warships, so constructing new tankers wasn't an option. Tankers were considered unglamorous and not a priority over warships, which led to a shortage when war began. Meanwhile, American submarines systematically targeted Japan's tankers, taking advantage of the vulnerability of Japan's supply lines. As the war progressed, the impact of the American submarine campaign was devastating. Every tanker sunk meant fewer tankers available to transport oil, which forced the remaining tankers to make more trips and spend more time at sea, exposing them to further attacks. This created a cycle where each loss made the remaining tankers more vulnerable, and the crew's morale plummeted. The shortage of tankers created a transportation choke point, and by late 1942, the situation had become critical. Oil that could have been transported from the captured oil fields sat unused in storage tanks because there were no ships available. By April 1942, Japan's oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels to 38 million barrels. The burn rate far exceeded peaceful projections, and the situation was becoming unsustainable. Despite efforts to remedy the situation, such as constructing new tankers or reducing the operational tempo, Japan could not overcome its logistical problems. Its fleet was now burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and tankers continued to be sunk by American submarines. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japan's fuel situation continued to worsen. Japan had been relying on the oil fields it had captured in Southeast Asia, but those fields were sabotaged by retreating Allied forces. Japanese forces couldn't restore production quickly enough to meet the needs of the military. Moreover, the infrastructure Japan needed to restore oil production was inadequate, and the lack of skilled technicians to repair damaged facilities further delayed the recovery process. In 1943, Japanese oil production reached just 76% of pre-war levels, but by then, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japan was no longer able to transport the oil that it had. By 1943, the fuel crisis was evident. Japan's reserves were rapidly depleting, and the tanker fleet was crippled by constant attacks from American submarines. Japan had enough oil to keep fighting for a while, but not enough to sustain a long war. The inability to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan meant that Japan was running out of fuel faster than it could replace it. The war was lost not due to tactical defeats or the brilliance of American generals, but due to the logistical shortcomings that Japan failed to address. The Japanese had made several miscalculations in their war planning, but the most critical one was their failure to properly understand and plan for their fuel needs. Japan's military planners underestimated the amount of oil they needed and overestimated the capacity of their oil fields and tankers. The war's outcome was determined by this one simple equation. Japan needed 40 million barrels of oil per year, but they only had 25 million. No matter how well they fought, Japan simply didn't have the resources to sustain a war. Admiral Yamamoto had understood the resource limitations from the start. He had warned that Japan could not win a prolonged war with the United States, but he was forced into planning the attack on Pearl Harbor because of institutional pressures. He died in 1943, knowing that the resource crisis was developing exactly as he had predicted. Yamamoto knew that even if Japan had achieved a tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, it wouldn't change the fact that they couldn't sustain a war against the United States. The war was lost in the mathematics of fuel consumption versus supply. Japan's failure to adequately calculate its logistical needs ultimately led to its defeat. When a nation ignores basic math in favor of political goals and suppresses analysis that challenges strategic decisions, the result is not just a loss, but a catastrophic. The story of Japan's fuel crisis is a reminder that wars are not won by bravery or skill alone. They are won by logistics, industrial capacity, and the ability to secure resources.